right, everybody, thank you for joining us for this virtual artist talk. Craig Hawkins is the artist. He currently has a show up in the Bob Owens Gallery on the Dahlonega campus, which is located in the Hogue Student Center. And I think you still have a few more days to catch that show before it comes down. Craig Hawkins earned his MFA in drawing and painting from the Lamar Dodd School of Art. He works as a professional studio artist and teaches at Valdosta State University. Conceptually, he's exploring ideas about what we all believe and whether or not it's true. Hawkins' faith gives momentum to the creation of works, which he exhibits nationally and internationally. He's represented at the Mason Fine Art Gallery of Atlanta, Georgia, and the Ann Nielsen Fine Art Gallery of Charlotte, North Carolina. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our welcomed guest, Craig Hawkins.
Thank you. First, I do want to thank the Director Cook and Professor Wilson for inviting me to exhibit and be here for the artist talk. It's an honor to be here. And without further ado, we'll just go ahead and continue. I'm a figurative artist. I get to draw and paint the human form. I have a passion for the work I create to invite the viewer into a shared experience and ask questions about what it means to be human. I love the construction of an image, and I love the potential that image has to mean something to someone. The impact of my work will vary from person to person because, who can truly predict what mindset, personal circumstances, or experiential baggage anyone brings with them when viewing a work of art. But through all those variables, I seek to present thoughtful questions with my art that will lead to meaningful conversations. Now, back in 2010, I began exploring the question, could a painting empower, promote, or exhibit the process of healing from a disfiguring event? I wondered this because a colleague and I were discussing the power of art and if art in some way could mimic the miraculous. This conversation focused on the potential documentation of a portrait painting process, depicting the visual record of disfiguring wounds healing before the eyes of the viewer. The healing would be seen by an artist painting over a pre-existing graphic image with an image absent of injury, scarring, or trauma. Now, this was a captivating idea at first, but I soon realized something just wasn't right. The idea lacked empathy. It was overly simplistic and lacked the truth of the trauma. It felt like an attempt to rewrite someone's story rather than coming alongside them, respecting them, and supporting them. Painting a portrait like this, even with the best of intentions, just seemed like the creation of a spectacle. Well, in 2012, I learned about a nonprofit organization supporting burn victims who are all living below the poverty line in India, and my artistic question began to take on a purpose-driven life of its own. That organization's name is Agni Raksha, and that name means protection from fire. Agni Raksha is led by two incredible sisters, a surgical burn specialist named Dr. Prima and a social worker named Chitra. Together, they help burn victims recover physically and psychologically while also providing educational training for socioeconomic rehabilitation. Most of these, most of those helped are female survivors of domestic violence. Bride burning, to be specific. Bride burning was outlawed in the 1960s, but is still known to happen today if a husband's family thinks the dowry paid for a marriage was insufficient. Someone from the husband's side of the family douses the wife in kerosene and lights her on fire. Oftentimes, children are caught up in the fire and burned, trying to save their mother. This is a horrible, dehumanizing act, and the need is huge, with an estimated 700,000 burn victims per year experiencing a life devastated by fire. When I heard about this, my heart hurt, and I felt a connection between Agni Raksha and my question about whether a painting might offer healing somehow. The general descriptions of these victims, the countless surgeries they undergo, the enduring strength required for it all, it sparked a desire in me to research and create works of art that would promote healing by honoring these victims and their value through portraiture. Now, I kind of got ahead of myself because I never would have heard about Agni Raksha if it wasn't for Wellspring International. Wellspring International is a nonprofit based in Alpharetta, Georgia that has come alongside Agni Raksha. Wellspring has provided support and resources to Agni Raksha for years, enabling continued growth and healing for many. I offered my artistic services to Wellspring, hoping to help raise awareness and a call for aid to these circumstances. Many emails and many years later, I found myself at a coffee shop with two key collaborators that breathed more life into my artistic question and brought a more empathetic and meaningful perspective to the table. Naomi Zacharias is the director of Wellspring International, and Jill Caratini was the director of Still Point Arts. Still Point is a vibrant, formal, nonprofit art gallery in Alpharetta, Georgia, supporting local and international artists. Based on photography by Elizabeth Jones that Wellspring commissioned and potential drawings and paintings I would create, Jill proposed an exhibition to raise awareness of these survivors and their value as human beings. This proposal led to a solemn acknowledgement between the three of us. Rather than painting portraits to show an imagined healing that would erase dehumanizing circumstances, it would be far more honoring and promote psychological healing to paint current and physically accurate portraits as an act of rehumanizing and presenting the enduring beauty of the human spirit through horrible circumstances. This acknowledgement totally reframed my artistic question into the following. Can I create an object that communicates an individual's inherent value and beauty, or an object that attempts to witness to and maybe even participate in the act of rehumanization with the permission of those who have suffered dehumanizing acts of violence? Well, to visually portray the invisible qualities below the surface and beyond the first impressions of a person requires the intentional use of time and symbolism. So let's unpack that process. In January 2018, I was given permission to paint the portraits of several women who have received help through Agni Raksha. At first, I was overwhelmed. I wanted all these portraits to be perfect. I was excited to paint, but felt a lot of self-imposed pressure to make every decision meaningfully count toward a beautiful result. And I wasn't even sure what that ultimately meant or even looked like. But so after a brief panic attack, I started with the basics. These paintings will be portraits, and portrait painting has a rich history. The painted portrait has a history of being a possession birthed from the pockets of the wealthy that signifies importance, financial or social power, and anything else that the patron wants to communicate to make themselves look the way they want their peers or future generations to perceive them. Portraiture can be a visual record of a person's character and story. Painting someone's portrait who doesn't fall into that category of wealthy or powerful is a modern concept. But either way, a portrait can honor someone and depict a person for future generations to know and remember. I thought turning a portrait's traditionally intended use upside down to promote the marginal, unrepresented, or vulnerable as valuable, beautiful, and resilient was life-giving. At this point, I was able to calm down because I recognized that the mere attempt to paint portraits of these chosen women was a way to honor them. As a series of portraits created with love and respect, maybe it could even be healing and worth sharing. At the foundation or first layer of these portraits, I chose to use gold leaf, and here's why. Gold leaf is a pretty straightforward way of taking monetary value and physically adhering it to an object. I figured if I was going to claim I believed the women I'm painting are inherently valuable, I needed to start with a symbol of that, even if most or all of this first layer gets covered up. In art history, gold leaf is often representative of the divine and eternal because it doesn't tarnish or rust. I felt this was another good reason to start with a silhouette of gold leaf because I believe God has placed eternity in our hearts. I'm also aware of a Japanese pottery mending technique called kintsugi, where gold dust is mixed into the glue, leaving beautiful rivers of gold as evidence of the repair process. The idea is that something broken yet mended is more beautiful than something that's never been broken before. I think this is true because self-giving love enters the narrative with the act of redemption. I hoped that the portraits I painted would reveal their foundation layer of gold through gaps in my brushstrokes and visually reference kintsugi's aesthetic. Now there's one last way I chose to use gold leaf. You may notice a very thin outline of a square behind several of the portraits once you see them. It's also around the outer perimeter of a couple as a unifying motif, if you're able to see the artwork in person. These are square halos. A square halo is a rare find in art history, but they do exist. They tend to represent a living saint as opposed to a dead saint with a round halo. The historic examples I have found point to the patron of the artwork depicted into a biblical narrative somehow, with the square halo distinguishing them from the rest of the story. Many of the women of Agni Raksha are women of faith, and I wanted to continue to represent a person's eternal value by symbolically referencing their relationship with God. Next, the presence of light became paramount. I'm also a wannabe Bible nerd, and the presence of light or a sunrise became a guiding aesthetic as I referred to ancient Hebrew scripture. Whether it's the declaration of joy coming in the morning, the creation of the world depicted as light and order overcoming darkness and chaos, a pillar of fire guiding an entire people group through a desert, the famous parting of the Red Sea, concluding in the morning light, or the resurrection of Christ at sunrise, light in the biblical narrative symbolizes rescue and salvation. Through Agni Raksha, I believe these women are experiencing a type of rescue, and I wanted to present this beautiful act of love for all to see. And with light and sunrise as an important symbol in these portraits, color symbolism also became intentional. And now I think we all know color can be very subjective, but I attempted to research what various colors generally represent in Indian culture. I focused on colors often found in a sunray, in a sunrise, and I found some general consensus that red represents purity and prosperity, saffron represents the sacred, the pure, and light, yellow represents peace, meditation, and honor, purple represents comfort, and blue represents bravery, virtue, and determination. I used drawing and painting to express all this symbolism. However, built into any act of drawing or painting from observation is spending more time with the subject than most people consciously do. Attention can equate to intimacy, and with so many long hours spent studying the images of these women, their faces have become very familiar. I feel like the women themselves have made an impression on me, and during their creation, I even caught myself saying good morning to these paintings as I entered my studio each day. I also felt it was important for this exhibition to acknowledge the beautiful act of love and service given through surgery. So I painted Dr. Prima's and Chitra's portrait, drew an operating room scene, and drew some of the surgical instruments used as well. While it's possible to mark over 9 years of questioning, seeking, offering, meeting, and planning, it all really culminated into a sincere heartbeat and 6 months of painting. These are the portraits that emerged. Humbly acknowledging that my empathy could never bring justice, I tenderly dared to imagine the marks of suffering made beautiful, scars made new through art, and to offer a means for viewers to respond. These works mark a near decade of imagining and cultivating a way to create toward that end. Beneath layers of paint and storied markings, each portrait carries gold leaf that's often unseen. Other times it appears in cracks and bears the story of a life inherently valuable and worthy of honor and love. Well, the exhibition exists. Each woman painted has seen their portrait and loves them. To be clear, the artwork does not lessen the tragic circumstances or attempt to call violent acts beautiful. In fact, it's a traveling exhibition that is continuing to provide a means to inform and talk about the enduring beauty of life and the inability of darkness to overcome it. A new surgical hospital in India is planned that will increase the amount of surgeries currently possible by 1,000%, and funds continue to be raised as part of this exhibition. You can visit wellspringinternational.org and craighawkinsart.com for more information. I'm humbled to recognize that my passion to create could contribute to such a worthy cause. So, can a work of art heal, bear witness to healing, or offer healing? I'm now convinced the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Thank you. All right, now I need to stop my broadcast here and get back to Zoom. Did I do it? Can you see me?
I think you did. I think you did.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Craig, for that discussion and explanation of your work. So, you talked about, I don't, at this point, generally, we have a time for questions, and Professor Hawkins has generously agreed to answer any and all questions that you have. So if I could kind of, I guess, start it off. So I noticed, because I saw the show a year ago at Still Point Gallery, and has it been a year or longer? I can't remember. It's been a while.
May have been, yeah, maybe 2018.
Yeah.
Or like the end of 2018, maybe.
Yeah. So, what I found striking was the softness and the warmth of the sitters, the subject matter of the women, and how much it shone through, even though there was this physical disfigurement. But then there was the juxtaposition with the kind of cold steel of the materials that were used to repair them. The images were very tilted and kind of, off the axis as far as the cropping and the framing of the compositions. Can you talk a little bit about what you were thinking about in that juxtaposition of the technology and the steel and the cutting, and then the softness of the portraits themselves?
Yeah, that's really cool that you noticed that. That was intentional. I think there's a total of 3 surgical instrument pieces that are just charcoal drawings, and there's one like a red pastel drawing of a surgical room or operating room, and Jill and I, as we talked through this and planning out the exhibition for the space, we wanted to make sure that while we were certainly focusing on the humanity of the individuals, we didn't want to ignore what they were going through and everything, while I was seeking a beauty and a warmth to come through, and again, based off of that that sunrise sort of feeling, we couldn't ignore both aspects. And so we, during that exhibition specifically, we tried to kind of spread out that, so it after seeing basically the color pieces, then you get to a black and white, and the intention of it being maybe a little bit discomforting, a little bit of a pause, that was the hope. So, and you're right to notice too that the drawings themselves were a little bit askew compositionally. Honestly, and that I was playing around with like armatures and looking for harmonics, but at the same time, it did add much more of a dynamic feel to it.
I think for me, what I sensed, or at least read into that, an icon painting of a saint, especially what you're looking at in the references from mosaics and things like that, has a very still and like static quality, very sculptural and solid, you know. And then you have this, you know, modern device of, you know, the strange cropping and the off-centered axis and things like that. And I don't know that even though those were saving instruments, there's also, you know, in order to cure, there's some horror that you have to go through, and a certain amount of violence that happens when they're trying to repair and heal. So I don't know. I was just struck by the tension between those two very different feeling tones, I guess is the word that I would use there. But thank you. Are there any other questions?
I
Craig,
think,
I see one in the chat from.
yeah, let's say Daniel put one in the chat.
Oh, let's see. Oh, okay, since paintings are constructed images, does the show depend on the photography to show to realism of the disfigurement? How do the paintings and photographs work together or depend on one another? That's a good question. Let me read through the first part and see if I can address the first part first. That's a good recognition of how a painting versus a photograph tends to operate. I can say in their relationship to one another, I was, although I think there was originally a plan for me to fly to India to meet these women. I was not able to, but the photographer was, and so I was completely reliant on the photographer's imagery, and all the pieces that you see are based off of photographic references. So, and it was a challenge for me to take my intentions and someone else's work that we were collaborating together on and attempt to, like you said in the question, to construct something with the intentions that I brought with me. So within the realism of the photography, I found it really. I wish Elizabeth could speak to this and tell the story of her experience when photographing the women, but she had this invitation, and there's a story where the women who were being photographed often shied away from the camera until Elizabeth approached them, talked with them, and really just showed them honor, love, and respect. And they, I mean, she may have had a specific heartbeat that she was driving at when approaching them. I don't know for sure, but and again, if she was here to tell the story, it'd be way more eloquent than I'm putting it now. But she allowed them to open up, and the pictures that she was able to capture, I think, are an amazing reflection of someone who has, on some level, accepted someone else accepting them. And so within, I think that captured through photography, I would call that a sense of realism, because of the moment that was captured there. And then my intention bringing to that was to continue to transform that into the heartbeat of the show. I hope that answers.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Craig, this is Erin. I don't know if you can see me. Can you talk a little bit about, or more about, your preparation in terms of drawing from the images that you would then paint, or how you determined which, like the specific image you would use for the portrait or for each portrait, or how you kind of narrowed down based on the reference photographs. What went into starting on the panel, or what went in before that part of it?
Yeah, so choosing the photography and then moving forward with the photo. Is that what you're pretty much
Yeah, I
asking?
mean, do you work through preparatory drawings before attempting a painting? I mean, you draw so much in your practice. I didn't know if you drew, then, you know, then made a painting or made a painted study, or just you know, plan and dive right into the painting.
I did some work in a sketchbook. I wouldn't call them preparatory or preliminary drawings necessarily. They weren't that developed, but I was honestly, when I was going through the photography, looking for basically one that seemed to jump out at me, one that I could imagine on a larger scale. And that scale had a lot to do with it. I wanted them to be somewhere in either a little smaller or a little larger than life size if possible. And then in other senses, I was wanting to capture maybe 3/4 of the figure, or the full face, and or somewhere in between. And I knew it. There was plenty of photography that in going through those images that that had full figures that I just didn't stick out to me. There was too much environment, and I was intentionally trying to find a way beyond the environment, because I knew there was going to have to be something that I would focus on, and then another part that I would whatever I was bringing to it. And at that point, at one point in the process, I didn't know what I was going to do or how I was going to deal with the background, but I knew I wanted to put the figures into a space just a little out of context, and hopefully allow the symbolism or the color field or patterns or whatever I was using, to the presence of light, ideally, to create the context and the atmosphere by which we would view the work. So so there wasn't a lot of preparatory like images, but there was a definite focus on composition, and I used Photoshop a lot with that, in like tilting or turning, zooming in and cropping. So there was a lot of that, and then oddly enough, there was an illustrator named, I think it's Robert Kondo. You know, he's with Tonko House. If students want to, then go to tonkohouse.com. He wrote this book called The Dam Keeper, and it's like a trilogy illustrated story. This is one of he used to be a Pixar artist, and he made the color script for Toy Story 3, I think. And he probably had his hands in other stuff too, but that's what stuck out to me. I kind of started following his work, and this book that he made, the presence of light was so I don't know, you could just feel it, and it was so warm coming off the page. It was like, ooh. When I came across it, I was like, that's what I want to play with. So I used his depiction of light in many of his pieces as sort of a reference, and I played with that in Procreate often, and in Photoshop to figure out, you know, the range and sort of the technique. Although it's still digital painting, it was sort of the technique that I was looking for, at least to develop further references. That I guess what I'm getting to is that I've never really used only the photographic reference as it originated from the photographer, but over time developed that into something that I was happy with, that I could at least refer back to as I played and explored what I wanted to do in terms of brush strokes and textures and things.
Thank you, Craig.
Yeah.
Other questions? Looks like Aaron's getting a question.
Oh, I see I see another question here in the chat. Will your work in this series, both in terms of the overall process and experience, as well as the question you began and ended with about healing and art, carry over in any specific ways to your process or future series you might pursue? That's a great question. I want to say just absolutely yes, because the collaboration, I'd never collaborated on a scale like this with really with anyone. And that collaboration was delightful and extremely meaningful. And I think more with the discussions that took place on how to approach whether it's talking about the subject matter, being able to bounce ideas off of each other, and how these paintings existed in a space, how they were ordered, even some of the compositions or colors and reasons why I was using that. It wasn't like just an internal dialogue, but it was prayerful, and it was communal with people who I now see as friends, and even in some ways family. So that process, definitely, I hope that could continue. And some of the ideas as I continue my artistic journey, many of my ideas seem to require me to reach out of my studio in some way, when normally I just kind of wanted to huddle down into a cave and just make what I want to make, kind of stuff. And that doesn't seem to be the case much anymore. I think that I'm certainly more interested in collaborating when possible. I hope that answered the question. Do we have, I see Aaron has totally transformed into another person. So is this someone with a question?
It looks like they're typing, perhaps.
Oh, okay, cool. There it is. So I went onto your series page online and was captured most by the image of the surgery. If I recall correctly, you said in the culture that red was a color associated with bravery and courage. Was this the reason for the decision to make this piece in all red as opposed to black color, the black colors of the other surgical instrument pieces? Yeah, it was. I wanted there to be a warmth, and I wanted to take that meaning and have that be just another layer that was associated with that. And let's see, I think red was, it wasn't bravery. I think it was purity and prosperity, if I'm not mistaken. But I mean, if I'd done it in blue, then absolutely that would. I think blue was the one for bravery and virtue and determination. Blue would have been an excellent choice too. I think in terms of like life or death circumstances, though, I kind of went with red on that one, not wanting the like the blue to. I guess in our own context, as we as Americans approach the pieces, might see them as less lifeful and or somewhat lifeless versus living. So I definitely want it to be red. And I guess in terms of surgery, you could also see how red could also kind of overlap with the presence of blood and whatnot. So it's a good question.
So I have another one. So you mentioned when you were talking about the Dam Keepers series, and I quickly looked it up and did immediately notice the color of light and things like that, the warmth of the images, the luminosity of the images. You talked about icons, the Byzantine mosaics. You mentioned a lot of artistic influence or inspiration kind of behind, or as a seed, or as a a way to kind of, I guess, give your images a grounding or a familiarity or a kind of vocabulary. Sorry, dog. That people could, I guess, kind of sense intuitively, perhaps. When I was showing my students in class, one of the squares behind one of the images, it reminded me kind of a Rothko-esque kind of form of abstraction. So the idea that, the abstract expressionists, especially Rothko, had a kind of spiritual quality to his work and was very interested in kind of a metaphysical quality in his work. I mean, did you look at sources like that? I also noticed in that same painting, there was a kind of filigree pattern, maybe a tile pattern or something like that superimposed over the figure. Could you talk a little bit about inspiration artistically and how, there's a line between emulation and imitation for artists?
Yeah, I'm glad you saw the Rothko. That's exciting to be noted. Aaron can attest to this. Even when we were in grad school, the square seemed to kind of be an obsessive thing for me while I was exploring, various different series. I think starting probably years ago, maybe as far back as maybe 2007 or 2006, I had some of these squares kind of floating behind just drawings of tools inspired by Jim Dine or his process, and wanting to kind of play around with his mark making and explore that all the way. But I think it started with me putting a template on paper. I think it may have been for just a small works exhibition that I wanted to submit to. And I was like, well, these are the boundaries. So I'm going to put this boundary on my paper, and whatever I draw needs to be within the boundaries. And at some point in creating more work, I just said, forget it. I don't care about the boundary, and drew through the square. And after doing that a couple times, I kind of liked the presence of the square. I didn't want to take it off. I just wanted to draw beyond it. Starting then, I think I can trace things back that far. But then, since then, I've had a series of box paintings, and even within those boxes, I mean, that was just a three-dimensional version of the square, or and really the edges of the canvas still worked that way for me at the very least. But whether it was about concealing or not, it still felt like that square was following me around. And Rothko definitely played a role in that. Is like the color field sort of aspect, kind of followed and showed up in my box series, and that's kind of stuck with me the further I've played. And so yeah, Rothko's still there. It's fun and a delight to hear that you noticed that, because that was certainly an interest.
Well, another, I guess, deeper dive into that same idea. How do you, a lot of students feel like if they look at other artists and they imitate them, and I'm using air quotes, I know that you can't see them, the line between imitation and emulation. They feel like they're stealing or ripping off or not being authentic if they, are borrowing. I think of Picasso's quote, "I don't find, I steal," meaning, he's actually robbing other artists blind of their tricks and techniques and even, stylistic kind of peculiarities. Can you talk about that and how you think about appropriation or at least emulation in your work?
Sure. I mean, it might just be really straight. It might not be that fantastic of an answer, but it's certainly honest. If I'm mimicking anything in something that I've seen, I need to question why in the first place, why that I want to. It can't be just because it looks cool or something, but it's most likely tied to a process or wanting to figure out the story behind or the purpose behind what the artist was doing at the time. I mean, if you've listened to any of the well, I can think of one specific video reference of Jim Dine talking about his own work. I think it's an old movie called A Portrait on the Walls, or Jim Dine, A Portrait on the Walls, I think. But to hear him discuss the act of drawing and the process behind it, that that sort of, for lack of a better term off the top of my head, like this behind the scenes, being able to hear the artist talk about the process, that's what mostly drives me in terms of influence. Of course, the visuals important, but I think the more I read about the why, the more I can connect with it. And because I'm connected with it in maybe more on a theoretical level or some sort of intentional level, I am not afraid of kind of using that same thought process and trying to apply it to my own work. So in that, it's maybe less mimicry, but more of an influence that, if the connection is visible and acknowledged, I have no qualms of acknowledging it whatsoever. So if it's noticed, but it's not always noticed, and most of the time it doesn't. I don't even care that if it has to be. So when it is noticed, then it's maybe more obvious, or there's just a kindred or a visual reservoir of images shared between two artists where that seems to pop out. Did that answer the question?
It did. Thank you very much. Other questions?
Craig, I have one more question. I'm working with intermediate painting this semester. My students are embarking on their first painted portrait, and it's more of a practical question. If you have any words of advice for them, as I think it is kind of a daunting. It's very different to paint a portrait than to draw it, and I think they're more comfortable with drawing, but shifting from line to shape and value blocks of light and dark. Could you speak to that a little bit? Thinking about your own start in portraiture and development.
Yeah. I think of painting in two ways. I think of it as sort of a layered cake where I start with broad, big shapes and kind of layer things up into smaller and greater detail. So, working from general to specific. But I also like to, I guess, take all the saturation out of a reference if I'm able to, or if not, maybe look if you have like a yellow pair of glasses or whatever to kind of look through and see. See things in more of a monotone or monochromatic sort of way, then I do that. But the other part is just acknowledging that these like puzzle pieces, these are flat, organic color shapes that of course they have tone and all too, but if you're matching the color that you see in front of you, whether this painting from direct representation, direct observation, or a reference from a photo, as long as you're matching those colors, you can be as expressive and even like disproportionate as you want, and you'll still create a visual space. And that's just that magic of putting two or more colors together, or surrounding one color with other colors that suddenly just our brains respond to it, and it pops in such a mysterious and exciting way of seeing form or seeing depth. And so my advice would be to definitely Don't look for things that have names. Just look for shapes, match some colors. Trust what you're matching rather than what's developing on the canvas, because also trusting that matching, you won't see the whole context until you get a lot of paint onto the canvas first. So within that process, at the beginning, it can be it can feel formidable, like you don't know what's gonna, you don't know if you're doing it right, and it just doesn't seem right. But if you just trust that process and only begin to respond and make tweaks when the entirety of the canvas is at least covered with one layer, then I'd say that's where I place or feel like I have a firm footing when I'm starting.
Thank you. I like your layer cake analogy. I think that's
Yeah. It's very celebratory too.
Oh, I see another chat question.
What brands of pastel and charcoal? That's a great one. I like talking about that. The pastel and charcoal do you use? Is there any medium thoughts you would share with your students using charcoal for the first time? So yeah, I do. There, depending on the brand that you choose in terms of charcoal, it moves on the paper differently. I mean, you can sully the surface of a paper, and the fibers, of course. So the paper that you use also can be important. But the charcoal itself, I tend to use this stuff. I've gone back and forth between. Give me 1 second. It's in my drawer right here. I'll look up the name. Okay, yeah. So I alternate, and these are relatively easy to come by, between the alpha color, which is actually, I mean, they make charcoal, but they also make like a black pastel that's sort of, I think it's lower in quality than standard pastels, but it's that soft blend that goes further and smoother than just normal charcoal. If general charcoal will blend up to a point that it requires much more application, like physical application with the stick. But alpha color charcoal, which I guess they've changed manufacturers over the years. They used to be made in, I think, Mexico, and now they're made, I can't remember, but it's like another country. So if you're able to find them on Amazon, when like the old ones, when they were made in Mexico, those are fantastic. And the other ones are okay, but they're just not as rich or and sooty black as the old ones were. They still tend to blend relatively well. The other ones that I tend to use, and these are sort of hit or miss depending on, I guess depending on just the box you get, because charcoal, can feel a little, well, some of the process maybe is inconsistent when they're manufactured, but Art Alternatives, which is just a common, I think, student brand, I tend to use those. They look something like that. And the old alpha color looks like this, charcoal with a K in there. But I love using those, but I'll use general charcoal pencils when it comes down to details and wanting to get really inside somewhere. Now with the pastels, I use where'd it go? Man, I thought they were right in that drawer. Sorry. I think in the past I've used Rembrandt pastels. Does Grumbacher make a pastel? That seems to be floating up to the surface. Well, anyway, so really just with pastels, you don't want I prefer not to use the cheaper brands that don't seem to have as much pigment. within them. You get what you pay for. So the higher pigment, the usually the further it will go and the more intense the color is going to be. And that's a whole different process though. And of course you always got to wear your mask while you're working with pastels, because it's like the most toxic dry material to work with. So be careful with that. But wearing a mask is no big deal these days. So. I think that answered that question. Let me double check, see if there was a part on the end. Oh, any thoughts about using charcoal for the first time? Just be defiant of it. Like, just go with it and be okay messing something up. I think if you're always aiming for, like, you test out to see what the middle tone application of the charcoal would be versus your darkest dark to the white of the paper. Find that middle tone and just keep that as like a standard that you can always, if you can get that dark easily and develop things, you can always go darker. And usually with a paper, if you go darker than the middle tone, you can always at least pull it out with the eraser to get back to the middle tone. So you kind of just have to treat your whites as sort of precious areas to be a little lighter handed with. But for the most part, it also depends on the paper you're working with too. But if you are, if you're just brave enough to dive in and go with at least that middle tone value, you're good.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, Professor Craig Hawkins, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We really appreciate your explaining your form and your content and your techniques and your philosophy on creation and on humanity. Very inspiring. So we really appreciate you and hope to see you again in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been great. Have a great night.
Great. Thank you.
Yay.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Good night.
Everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.